All right, so does everyone see the slides okay? Is that coming up all right for everyone? Yeah, hopefully that's a yes. Okay, so thank you to Dale for the introduction. If at any point you do want me to stop as we go through, please just write in the chat if you've got any kind of comments or questions about any of the content as I'm talking through it. I'm more than happy to stop and explain particular things as we talk, rather than saving it all to the end. So completely up to you if you wanted to interrupt. As Dale was saying, I am a lecturer at the University of Kent. Prior to that, I've been a strength and conditioning coach for 15 years, I think it is now, so quite a long while. And my background really, was within the private school sector where I spent 10 years, but also working as part of the TAS program, where I worked with quite a wide range of athletes. So anyone from age 14 up to full professional. Within that, I prepared numerous athletes for the Olympic Games, World Championships, European Championships, and kind of the like as well. So kind of a vast array of different experiences, I suppose, is where I come from. Within my work as a coach, the lack of kind of knowledge and appreciation around sleep factors was something I always observed within all of the different cohorts I was working with. And I think really that's what kind of directed me into looking into this factor with a little bit more detail and kind of understanding actually, what do we need to know as practitioners and how can we inform our athletes to make better choices with regards to their sleep practices. So in terms of the session for today, we're going to be first of all looking at sleep recovery and performance, and we're going to be asking the key question really around, well, why is sleep important to athletes? Why is it important that actually we sleep well? What do we need to know? How's that going to impact our performance, or is it going to impact our performance? We're then going to talk a little bit around sleep monitoring. So we're going to think about how we can actually start to track some of this information and then feed that forwards to try and improve in certain areas. And then lastly, we'll be talking a little bit around building a strategy. So we've gathered all this information, but what can we do with that now? How are we going to actually understand how to develop ourselves moving forwards? So what we tend to see in professional practice is everyone's very, very good at doing these kind of smaller scale interventions. So everyone loves the saunas, the ice baths, the compressions, all of that sort of stuff. But actually, in terms of the bigger and the more impactful things, that's where we need to be directing our focus towards that sleep, nutrition, psychology, and those different larger scale components, because that's where we're going to have the most impact. In terms of sleep throughout different ages, so I thought it'd be useful just to share so we can see actually how sleep responds at different life points, so different points in our life and how that adjusts. And you can see it's not linear throughout, so there's a different level of sleep that's required at different life stages. Now, when obviously within this, we're not necessarily focused around the kind of pre-end of that. We're looking towards school age, teenagers, young adulthood, but also into older adulthood as well when the time comes, hopefully not yet. But
Oh, the sound's cut off again.
oh, is that better?
Yeah, it's back now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm unsure why it keeps going off and on. Is it working all right your end, Dale? Okay, well let's just try and carry on. If it keeps cutting off, just someone cut in and just give me a shout, and then hopefully we can continue at that point. So in terms of athlete specific recommendations, a recent paper came out suggesting that we should be having 8.3 hours in terms of to report satisfaction with our sleep. Now, obviously, there's quite a lot of individual difference within that. So how much sleep I need would vastly different to somebody, of the same age and doing the same sport, because we each have individual demands. But what we see as a common trend is that performance deficits are very much evident with sleep durations of less than 6 hours. Okay, so we see that as kind of a common theme across all different age groups, males, females, and the like, and all different sports as well. So that's something that runs with commonality across a variety of different cohorts. So really, when we're thinking around sleep, we need to be looking actually, first of all, are they hitting the markers that are required, but actually as kind of a minimum threshold, are they getting above that 6 hours? And that's something to reflect on within your kind of personal, how you sleep personally at the moment. So in terms of the effects of sleep on recovery, we know that chronic short sleep leads to reduction in muscle mass during a training block than controls. So if we have two people training with the exact same training program, those who sleep less, so those who don't often get the required amount of sleep, they're going to be able to develop less muscle mass. So they're going to be having a lesser effect out of their training than people who do get enough sleep. Okay, now in terms of, you know, athletic development and progressing in your sport, that's obviously going to be quite problematic. We also see that those who sleep less than 6 hours regularly, they're 4 times more likely to become sick upon encountering a virus. Okay, now again, in terms of availability for training time, you know, we want to be fit and healthy. We want to be able to train. We want to be able to repeatedly train time and time again. If we're having our training schedule interrupted by regular bouts of sickness, that's going to become really, really problematic. And again, over the course of a year, we're not going to have developed to our best ability. We also see sleeping less than 8 hours, you're 1.7 times more likely to sustain an injury than those that are sleeping greater than 8 hours. Now, that point of reference comes from a study done with adolescent athletes, but I think the point I wanted to make with this is that's pretty vast, okay? And the study was done, I think, with those that were 14 to 18 years old. So, you know, you're nearly 2 times more likely to get injured than those that are sleeping 8 hours or more, okay? That's pretty vast, and that's quite impactful. In terms of the effects of sleep on performance, we see that sleep status affects jump performance. It also reduces joint coordination, and it can also affect skill accuracy. Okay, so if we think about the fact that most sports have some sort of jump element encompassed, you know, whether it's kind of a 2-footed jump, single-footed jump, whatever it might be, there's some sort of jumping element within many, many sports. In terms of the middle point here about reducing joint coordination and producing suboptimal biomechanics, and what we mean by that really is just biomechanics that aren't particularly favorable. So they're not getting the best outcome. So they're kind of reducing the efficiency of the movement or putting somebody into a position which could injure them. And we see that short sleep duration does that. So again, you know, from a safety perspective, that's something to consider. We also see that sleep affects skill accuracy. So we know that when you sleep less, the skills you produce are less accurate than when you've had sufficient sleep. A couple of examples that I've highlighted here has been demonstrated with tennis serve, basketball, free throw, but the application of the principle applies to many, many different sports, including golf, swimming. All the skills like that are going to be affected by lack of sleep. So hopefully now we understand the kind of importance around that, and let's think a little bit around how we actually monitor this. There's a few different methods we can look at in terms of monitoring. I've just highlighted some of the ones on here. We'll just turn our attention to the top two. So if we look at the watch over there, that's called an actigraph device. And what that does is it takes a reading of sleep, based on your wrist normally, based on movement count. So it's how much you move, and that's how it detects whether you're awake or whether you're asleep. The image there has displayed a research device. It's called a research grade device, but of course there's also commercial devices available, things like Apple Watch, Oura Ring, Fitbit. All of those types of devices are just variations of that actigraph. And I think, you know, we have a good opportunity to tap into some of that wearable tech data where we can. Of course, if we don't have any of that, we can turn to the self-report. And all that means is, you know, as the name suggests, you self-report your sleep status. So you report how long you've slept for, you know, rating of sleep quality maybe sometimes as well. But it relies on you obviously producing that accurate information in order to feed that forward to your coaches or to yourself if you're having a look at it yourself. So in terms of the self-report, now many environments use the self-report as kind of a standard piece of practice, and I think it can be useful. You know, within academies, we see it very much a standard practice that players will wake up. The first thing they'll do in the morning is go onto the app, and they'll just report a very basic sleep duration. They'll report a sort of 1 to 5 sleep quality, things like that. We're also seeing it now implemented within some schools environments, within sports scholarship programs. And again, it can be a useful way of just kind of having eyes over somebody's sleep. In terms of the data quality of that, though, so, you know, is that an accurate way of tracking sleep, I guess, is what we wanted to find out. And I just wanted to turn attention to a little bit of research that we did this year. We wanted to look to see actually, is the self-reported sleep duration. So if somebody tells us how long they've slept for. Is that accurate? So we've compared their self-report to the watch data, and we had a look. Do the two match up? Is it the same thing? So we asked 22 female athletes to do this study, and they were from the WSL Academy League. So they were all playing within the under 21 squad, and we had players that were within that 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. So late teenage, early 20s type cohort is where we were looking within this. So we asked them to do the self-report, so provide us with the information around how long they slept last night, whilst also wearing the actigraph watch. And then we compared the data to see whether it was the same thing. So what we found, there was a tendency for players to overestimate their sleep by 32 minutes on average. So each night on average, the report that they were giving us was 30 minutes longer than what the watch data was actually showing us. In some cases, we had disagreement. So we had the two numbers, the self-report and the actigraph report, being out by 2 hours. Okay, now that's a really, really vast spectrum, because thinking back to the points of reference I highlighted at the start of the presentation around optimal sleep durations, if somebody's told me they've slept for 6 hours and they've actually only slept for 4, that's a huge problem. Equally, if they tell me they've slept for 8 hours and actually they've only slept for 6, again, that's quite a big problem. So I think accurate reporting of that, it's something to really consider, and how we're kind of getting the information around how long we've actually slept. So it led us to kind of question, well, what is the usefulness of taking that self-reported data, and really what we advised the club in this instance is, where possible, try and use some objective monitoring methods, such as the smartwatches, whatever you've got to hand, Apple Watch, or go down the route of looking down some validated questionnaires as a monitoring method. And we're going to come on to that in just a second, having a look at some of those validated questionnaires. So some of the examples of the questionnaires that can be used, and what I mean by validated questionnaires, I mean ones that have been done within the research and compared against those objective measures. So things like the watch data. Do the numbers match up against the watch data? So if somebody tells me that they're sleeping fine, does it match up to that questionnaire? Are the two in agreement? And if the answer is yes, it informs us as coaches and practitioners that it's probably quite a good tool to be using, and we're happy to go ahead and use it. So some examples of kind of these validated questionnaires that we trust to provide us with good sleep data are just listed here. So the Athlete Sleep Behavior Questionnaire, the Sleep Hygiene Index, the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, or the Morningness Eveningness Questionnaire, or the Adolescent Sleep Hygiene Index. Now, what I thought it might be worth us doing is having a look over this one here. So I'll just leave it up on the screen. But what I'd like us to do is just take a couple of minutes and just see if we can work through the questions within this questionnaire. It's a very, very simple questionnaire, as you can see. So it's just 18 questions. You're going to score everything as a 1 to 5. So all you've got to do is, for each thing, just think about whether it's a never, a rarely, a sometimes, a frequently, or an always. Okay, so within that, just score each question 1 to 5. Once you've done that, just add up the total, see what numbers you've got. And then what we'll do in just a couple of minutes, if everyone's happy and a few people don't mind, we'll share that. And let's see kind of how we're looking in terms of our kind of observations around some of these sleep metrics. So is everyone happy just to crack on with that for a couple of minutes, and then we'll feed back in maybe 3 or 4 minutes and see what we've got? I'll put it back up, Nisha, don't worry. There we go. Okay, is everyone pretty much done with that? Does anyone need any more time? No? Okay, so if everyone's done, so add the score up, just give it a total. Would anyone like to share their score? And there's no kind of correct answer on this, so please don't worry about it, you know, being high, low, whatever. Let's just see where we're at, and then we can kind of discuss it in a little bit more detail. So would anyone like to share?
Yeah, I'll do mine in a sec. I've just not added it up yet. I think I'll
That's
break
fine,
the
no
ice for
worries.
us.
Yeah.
I'll break the ice for us.
I got 38 on mine, which I don't think is too good.
38. Okay, thanks for sharing, Chloe. That's fine. Let's get a couple more and then see where we're at.
I was 37.
37.
I got 37 as well.
37. Does anyone else want to share what they got? You don't have to, it's just if you wanted to. Oh, okay, that's fine. So let's move on. Now, when we look at these scores as coaches and we kind of review this data, generally when this questionnaire was put together, the kind of level of good, if you like, so what was perceived as good. Okay, so we've got 25 as well. A level of good was around the 36 mark, you know, and anything above that we don't want to see. Now, for me, that's kind of that's pretty wild in terms of metrics, because actually we see that people with the, you know, even the lower scores, even the 28, 29 type scores, they still have a lot of room for improvement in terms of their sleep hygiene. So for me, I don't go with, you know, this arbitrary cutoff point of a 36. I like to look at the data with a little bit more nuance, if you like. Now, how many people got various scores above 3s in a few different questions? Did everyone get a few that were sort of in the 4s and the 5s? And I think almost a better way of looking at this data, so Chloe did, yeah, and yeah, I imagine Dale as well with those types of 30 plus scores. So when we're looking at the 4s and 5s, really that's the biggest intervention we can have. So the trick is then to look into where we actually scored the 4s and the 5s, and how can we make adjustments to our sleep hygiene in order to improve in those areas. So these types of questionnaires can be really useful in terms of informing our next steps as practitioners or athletes in terms of our sleep adjustments. And again, I can send that questionnaire around because it's quite a useful thing to repeat throughout the year. You know, if you do it 2 or 3 times, you can start to see, actually, am I improving in certain areas? Am I getting worse? And if I am, what's the reason behind that? So it kind of informs a little bit around actually how your sleep is looking as a whole. So I can ping that out and I'll send it across to Dale after the end of this. So let's get back into the presentation. And now that we've got that information, as I said, you know, it's a starting point for discussion. Anything above a 3, I think we should be highlighting as a potential for improvement or a discussion point with the coach. And those repeating throughout the year points is really important. Okay, so it's up to you how often you want to do it. With the athletes I work with, I tend to do it about 4 times a year so that I can have those different review points. But I don't want to do it sort of, you know, every 2 weeks, because actually probably not much is going to change, and you know, people will just get fatigued of kind of always doing the same thing. But you know, I think bi-monthly, every other month, 4 times a year, something like that is probably a really good starting point to go with. So we've got all that information. We've got a little bit now in terms of our scoring. So we've monitored kind of our sleep hygiene and had a look around actually what our sleep habits look like. So what do we do now? Well, now we need to build a strategy. Now we need to understand how we're actually going to improve in terms of our sleep. So what sleep hygiene means, just to familiarize people with this term, if you weren't sure about what that actually means, it means just supporting habits that are supportive to sleep. So encouraging habits that are supportive to sleep and avoiding habits or behaviors that are disruptive to sleep. And we're going to talk around some of the elements of that really within this slide here. Now, within sleep hygiene, there's a few different categories or different kind of priority focus areas that we can talk about. The top one being evening behaviors. So what do I do in the evening, and how can I ensure that the things I do in the evening are helpful to my sleep? We can then look at environmental factors, and what we mean by that is different, you know, different environments that we are in the evening and how that can impact upon sleep health as well. An area that's often overlooked is that aspect of daytime behaviors. So actually, we know that what we do in the daytime also impacts us at nighttime. Okay, so understanding our daytime behaviors and the impact on sleep, and also light exposure, and that's a really key one. So in terms of evening behaviors, just get some of these ones up, not that one, sorry. So we'll look at relaxation, reading, consistent bedtime. Things like yoga can be really helpful pre-bed. Now, it kind of goes without saying that we want to be relaxed in the evening, but actually it's that element of relaxation that leads us into the first stage of sleep. So without that, we actually can't initiate sleep. So that's really important. In terms of a consistent bedtime, and I know this is one a lot of younger athletes struggle with, you know, and again, because of the sort of competing demands around scheduling and homework and, you know, got to be up for school and everything else. So I know a lot of people struggle with that. But as much as possible, where we can get consistency in the time that we go to bed, that's a very important habit to maximize our sleep duration and maximize our sleep health. So where possible, I try and advise people to, you know, look at your schedule across a week, decide what time it's feasible for you to be going to bed on a regular basis, and put that in as kind of a binary line that you're going to work backwards from. And we'll talk about that in a minute, how we can start building a schedule of our sleep. In terms of the environmental factors, these are kind of the two primary things that we need to consider. Firstly, our bedroom needs to be dark, and you know that might be sort of an obvious thing, but actually you'd be quite surprised with the amount of people that don't sort of take that very seriously and just have a super light net curtain or something like that. You know, it needs to be full blackout, because actually any light exposure can start to firstly block us getting into those entry levels of sleep, and actually disrupt us as we get into the deeper stages of sleep later in the night as well. There's no kind of distinct temperature advice. Well, there is a little bit. 18 to 21 is the ideal sleeping temperature, but there's a little bit of nuance around that for each individual. I always suggest, if you're in doubt, go for the lower temperature. So, you know, keep your room sort of 18 degrees if you can. I would assume that most people don't have a climate control within their bedroom. Maybe they're not, you know, you're not set up like a hotel. But where you can, you know, make a sort of educated guess around that. If you're walking into your bedroom and the radiator's blasting out and it's, you know, super hot when you enter the room, that's not going to be a conducive environment to have good and healthy sleep. So, you know, open a window for a little bit, cool it down a little bit, and then you can start your, you know, getting into bed and relaxing. In terms of the daytime behaviors, these are the primary two that we need to consider here. So firstly, morning light exposure, and that's actually really important in terms of setting our circadian rhythm for the following night. So if I get up in the morning, getting out into morning daylight should be one of the first things I can do. Now, obviously we're in winter at the moment, so it's not actually getting light until whatever time, 8 a.m. or something like that. I can't think what time the sun rises at the moment, but where possible, we need to be getting out into that morning light. I think a good way to do that, you know, and it sounds really silly, but a quick walk around the garden before school, a walk into school rather than driving in the car can be beneficial. So it's just thinking around ways where you can get that natural exposure to that natural daylight as kind of efficiently as possible, and in conjunction with, of course, your morning routine, because you have to get to school or, you know, get to training, whatever you guys do. Furthermore, exercise can have an impact on our sleep behaviors. Now, I would assume this is an area that everyone's kind of ticking more than. So, you know, I imagine you guys trained with reasonable regularity. And it's, you know, morning or evening training, it was always a little bit of a debate. There is some evidence to suggest that morning training has a better impact on sleep the following night. But I do appreciate as well, you guys probably at the moment aren't in a position to be kind of adjusting your training schedule. You're probably somewhat constrained to what the coaches tell you. So as much as possible, you know, maybe consider that, but we can't have too much of an impact on it. But regardless of that, there's still plenty of other things that we can consider with regards to our sleep hygiene. In terms of light exposure, now, sorry, not that one. Again, this is one I think that, you know, from observation of athletes I work with, this is one I would say is done quite poorly. You know, the first consideration really is around screen use and the amount of screen use that people have routinely within the evening. But secondly, just around a really simple consideration of just reducing evening light. So, you know, turning off that main overhead light and just switching on some really soft level lamps, things like that. That can be quite a powerful intervention to actually help the sleep regularity and help you switch off at night. You know, and again, really small, simple lifestyle adjustments that don't really take too much thinking, but that could be quite impactful over time. We're going to talk about screen use a little bit more in a minute. because it's got its own special slide, because it's kind of that much of a focus, I think, within young athletes as a cohort. But I would just say this, there's been a couple of articles and couple of publications come out recently that have looked into, you know, what actually are we looking at on screen and how that affects our sleep that night. And there's a lot of evidence around social media use in the evening, because not only have you got the light exposure element, so you've got obviously the light coming out your phone, your iPad, whatever you're looking at, but it's also the psychological stimulation. Okay, so your brain's wiring, you're thinking about comments and, you know, so and so's written this and what can I write on that. So it's also the psychological element which has an impact on sleep as well. So in terms of the sort of screen use, the effects are twofold. One, the light exposure, but two, that psychological stimulation as well. And we'll talk in a minute about how we can kind of modify some of these evening routines. So in terms of building a strategy, you know, hopefully by now I've convinced you firstly of the importance of sleep for sports performance. Secondly, kind of presented you some methods of monitoring, so some things that you can do as an athlete, that you can inform your coach and work together to kind of look over your sleep as a part of your training development, if you like. But then now, what do we actually do about it? You know, how do we go about making these adjustments? And I've kind of come up with this 4-stage process here. And the first thing is to have a look at your usual weekly routine. And it might not be consistent across the 7 days. You know, everyone's got training on different days. It might be that you have, you know, different school clubs. It might just be that you want to do some social activity on different days, you know, and that's absolutely fine. So the first thing to do is kind of take that observation around your weekly routine. And you want to look exactly what's going on in the evening, what time you're having dinner, and I'll give you some examples of that in just a second. So across that, let's say you've got 7 days of that written down, start to look, well, what's the common areas here? Okay, what am I seeing which is happening day after day after day? What are the common themes that I can start to build upon? Another thing is to also review that questionnaire data. So the one that we've done today, you know, if you wanted to have a look over that with your coach, like I said, start looking at where the scores are, the 3s and above. Okay, that's where you want to start looking at. Once you've got that information, it's going to help you target which priority areas you need to start working on. And think about what we know about sleep hygiene, okay, and how those changes could be implemented within this routine. Now, we've talked about a lot of this stuff here. So we've given some ideas already around sleep hygiene and sleep habits and sleep routines. And now it's over to you to kind of think, well, actually, how can this be mapped into my evening routine? What sort of stuff could I start doing? So here's just a brief example. Okay, let's say I've tracked the data for 7 days. I've written down my 7 days of my evening habits, and I've identified some things that I do well. So I'm eating more than 2 hours before bed, so I'm not going to bed feeling really full and, you know, heavy, like I've got a lot of food in my tummy. And I wake up feeling quite good. Okay, so those are 2 good observations that I've taken there. What I could improve upon, well, I normally look at my phone in bed, okay, and again, going back to what we know here, we know around screen time and light exposure and stuff like that. So if I'm looking at my phone for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, you know, I'm potentially impacting my sleep from that perspective. And I also have an inconsistent bedtime. So I'm going to bed at all these different times, which again, going back to our sleep hygiene slide, we know that's not necessarily going to support healthy sleep habits. So that's our 2 observations. Well, then we have to ask ourselves, well, you know, that's all very nice around the inconsistent bedtime, but what constraints do I have? Do I have an inconsistent bedtime simply because training finishes at 9:30 on a Monday and, you know, 7:30 on the other day, so I can get to bed a bit earlier? Is that the reason why? Is it anything I can do about it? Okay, and if the answer is no, fair enough. Then we look back to this, we see what other aspects we can pick on instead. If we can make a small adjustment, fantastic, let's do that and let's move forwards. And the second question, and arguably the most important one, is that of what will I actually stick to? Okay, I could obviously give you the, you know, time and time again when I've written a sleep program for somebody, given it to my athlete, said, you know, go away, crack on, and they come back and they've done nothing because what I've written is too ambitious, or it doesn't kind of align with, you know, how they want their evening to go, the stuff that they want to do. So you need to consider that really carefully. What will I actually stick to? If you put in, you know, we talked about regularity and going to bed at the same time. If you put in a 9 p.m. bedtime, you're going to do that 7 days a week. But then you're finding actually after day 2, that's not enough time. You've got no homework done. You've barely, you know, spoken to your parents or anything else. you're not going to stick to that. It's not going to last very long. So be realistic within your own kind of situational constraints, and actually, you know, with regards to how you're going to actually enjoy and really embed this strategy within your lifestyle. So this is just one such example that I put together for one of my athletes. So his biggest thing, he loves watching TV. He was really into that. He really wouldn't get away from this kind of 1 hour of TV. He used to really enjoy doing that. And he used to have his TV time, which would finish about 9:45 p.m. Okay, so it used to be that he would sort of have a later dinner, and then he'd just sort of, you know, hang around for a bit doing whatever. But then the TV would be on from sort of 8:30 to 9:45, and he'd just sort of, you know, lay there doing that. So what we looked at, and his sleep was quite badly affected, and we did pinpoint it down to the fact that actually all of this light exposure was quite triggering, along with a few other different things as well. So this is the strategy that we came up with here. Now, he had a yoga and stretching routine because it was something that he was doing actively as part of his club. He was a footballer. So we thought, okay, great, let's implement that. Let's use that as almost like a relaxation strategy. And we'll put it in from 9 till 9:30. Bedtime is always going to be at 10. We kept that super consistent, and he was able to achieve that. Instead of disregarding, you know, the TV time, which is what he really enjoyed, and it was sort of a bit of family time as well, let's just budge that back. So we're not going to get rid of it, because then this person probably wouldn't stick to it, but we can adjust that back. We'll start it at 8 p.m. You can still enjoy it at 9, you know, up to 9 p.m. Fantastic. But at that point it goes off. And once it goes off, that's the cue really to put your phone away. And we got him, you know, again, he was quite a phone in bed type guy. He had a real habit of kind of scrolling in bed. So what we did was we actually got him to charge his phone in the lounge downstairs. Once the TV goes off, phone's on charge, off you go for the night. You don't give it a second thought. And actually, after about a week or so of this plan, he said how refreshing it was to be able to sort of switch off a little bit and not have, you know, the messages pinging and the disruption and stuff like that. So it was a really positive adjustment for us. After we've done all that, as I said, we go into that yoga, light stretching routine, that recovery, relaxation aspects. At 9:30, we start getting ready for bed. Whenever that's done, by the time you've, you know, showered, brushed your teeth, whatever you want to do, a bit of reading, and then we did lights off at 10 p.m. Now, that's just one such example of how you could structure that evening routine, but obviously with your own situational constraints and your own preference for different routine aspects, it would be up to you to put your one together. And, you know, again, that's something you could do with in collaboration with your coaches as well. In terms of weekday versus weekends, I often get questions around that, because often people want to sleep in on the weekends to kind of catch up from that missed sleep in the week, perhaps if they're chronically undersleeping, as it were. My advice is always this: keep to the same bedtime where you can. Okay, so don't allow yourself to get into that habit of going to bed really, really late on the weekend, because then when we try and bring that schedule back for the Monday, it becomes very difficult and very problematic. But my advice would be, if you are very tired, allow that wake up time to be really fluid. Okay, so keep that 10 p.m. bedtime 7 days a week, but on that Saturday and Sunday where you don't need to be up for a particular school or whatever it might be, just let that wake up time flow. Don't set an alarm. Let yourself sleep as much as you need to recover. We also have the potential for what we call sleep banking if needed on the weekends. So obviously on the weekends, we don't have the constraint of school. So it means that people can sleep a little bit more. And where people are kind of very sleep deprived, I often advocate just a sort of 15-minute nap on a Saturday and a Sunday. And the best time to place that is after lunch. So 1 p.m, 2 p.m, those types of times, no longer than 20 minutes. Otherwise, we start to have potential impact for the subsequent night's sleep as well. So that would be where the napping opportunity comes in. As I said, with screen use, you know, my advice would always be don't cold turkey it. I've found in the past that that's, you know, a terrible way to kind of build and develop habits, and routinely people just give up on that. You know, if you sort of say I'm never looking at a screen past 8 p.m, it just doesn't happen. So, you know, unless you're going to be super diligent with you, I'd say just avoid it. And kind of think about actually what's your level of usage now, right now, you know, in terms of phone use, for example, what's your level of usage now? Well, can we just back that off by 30 minutes rather than just whipping it all away? Or can we put it to an earlier time, for example? So think about how that's going to fit within your personal schedule and what's realistic for you. So in terms of just summarizing and bringing it together then, I've talked about how athletes of all ages commonly have suboptimal sleep. So it's really common that we see athletes have bad sleep. And the reason for that is multifactorial: stress, training times, you know, competing demands, school, whatever else. There's a lot going on. So because of that, putting together an evening routine can be a really powerful thing, and that's something that can really help support your sleep status. Fundamental to all of that is the consideration around your personal sleep hygiene. Okay, so all of those factors we talked around in terms of supporting those habits that are positive for good and healthy sleep, what can you do within your circumstance to support that? Small, like anything really, small changes at a time are more likely to stick. I wouldn't suggest you go away from this talk today and just kind of rip up your whole routine for how you normally choose to behave. I think the chances are with something like that, not much will stick. You might do it for a week, 2 weeks at a push, and at that point you'll start to drift back. If you think about those more smaller actionable changes, they're a lot more likely to stick. So pick kind of your key priority areas that you think you could improve upon, start with those and take it from there. And I guess, a question as well, what works within those situational constraints? That's a really pivotal one. And it goes back to what I said, what are you actually going to stick to realistically? So that's it from me. In terms of question, I'll stop sharing if that's okay. And then we can, go to any questions that you guys might have. Equally, if you haven't got anything from now, please feel free just to reach out to me at any given point later. Happy to take emails. My contact is just here as well, so it's just at Julie Gooderick on any social, Twitter, X, whatever we call it, Instagram, whatever. So more than happy for you guys to reach out to me on that if you've got any further questions. Has anyone got any questions for now?
I'll jump in first, Julie. Just want to say thank you very much. That was brilliant. It was really interesting. We spend almost a third of our lives asleep, and yet very few people really think about how important it is and how to maximise it. So I think it's really interesting and very beneficial. So thank you on that. I do have a couple of quick questions which I think some of the athletes might like to know. One around sort of theoretical benefits and a couple around sort of practical tips for some of the issues my athletes certainly have. But just so that everyone knows, Julie's still recording this, so I'm going to ask my questions now. But if anyone does have any questions that you don't want to be recorded, or you want to ask any of us at the end, we're happy to turn the recording off and just hang around for a minute or two later on. So I'll ask these questions now, which will go out to everyone, and then we will have some time at the end that's not recorded in case anyone wants something a bit more confidential perhaps. So first question from me, Julie, was just in terms of the importance of sleep. You obviously mentioned a lot around injury risk. Do you know any of the evidence supporting skill acquisition or motor skill development in terms of how sleep can affect that? Because I think that's something a lot of our athletes would be really interested in too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I talked a little bit around kind of the reverse of that. We know that with short sleep, skill is negatively affected. So we see that coordination goes down. We see that reaction time goes down. But in terms of the retention of skill as well, there's quite a lot of evidence within the research body that demonstrates actually if I teach you a skill and you go away and you have 8 hours sleep, you're going to retain that skill a lot greater than if you go away and have 6 or 4. So actually in terms of skill retention, it can be a really powerful tool. And again, I'd kind of link back to, if you reflect on how you're progressing through training, and let's say you might feel like you've hit a bit of a plateau, I think sleep should always be one of the first things we review at that point, because actually it could be that we're just not putting ourselves in a physiologically good place to actually retain the skill or develop the muscle mass or get stronger, whatever it might be. So yeah, to answer your question, there's a lot of research around that, and it's a really important aspect.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I think it's all of our athletes they'll go work really, really hard at training, but then through either poor sleep or poor nutrition, they almost waste that effort. So I think
exactly,
you've done the hard work already. Let's not make sure that you let that go to waste by having poor sleep or poor nutrition or poor psychology, etc., etc. So sleep obviously a massive part of that, and thank you. The next, these are sort of 2 questions just around some of the athletes that I work with personally, and I know some of the athletes who are still on this call, they experience some issues around travel. So if they are away, I know I have some athletes who go internationally for a short period of time. They've got a tennis tournament in Switzerland Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or some of our basketball team, for instance, are away somewhere at 7 o'clock tonight. They might be napping on coaches or whatever. So just, do you have any sort of practical tips around how best to support your sleep schedule while travelling, whether that's internationally or domestically? And then a sort of related one is around feeding. If you are getting home late or you are away and you can't have your dinner till 11, 12 o'clock at night sometimes because you've been training after the match, are there any foods to avoid or tips around how to structure that? So kind of twofold question there for you, Julie.
Yeah, that's fine. So I'll cover the travel one first, if that's okay, Dale. So
Yep.
yes, with regards to travel, and again, that's something with a lot of athletes I work with that routinely have kind of weekly competition. So the first thing I would suggest is come up with kind of a home and away schedule. So what I ask my guys to do is they come up with their sleep hygiene routines for when they're at home. They come up for one with post-match for when they're in the hotel. So straight away, they've got that kind of twofold thing. They know that when they're here, they do that. When they're there, they do that. And we plan it down to the fine, the fine detail, to the point, walk in the hotel room, put the lamp on, set your aircon to 18, go in the shower. And we plan it literally that regimented, because actually they find quite a lot of benefit from that. In terms of international travel, we kind of open up a whole world of debate around that, because it depends very much where you're going and the time differences and things like that. So that, at that point, sometimes I implement some of the pharmaceutical aspects as well, in terms of short-term supplementation. And sometimes as well, domestically, I implement some of those short-term supplementations as well, if it's a tight turnaround and we need to recover quick and stuff like that. So a supplement I quite often go to is the nighttime recharge. We sometimes use that in the short term. If we're traveling big transatlantical type distances, we do look at melatonin supplements for 3 days, and sometimes we implement that. But I like to avoid those where possible. And for me, it's always the routine based comes first. If we can't hit what we need to achieve with that, then we go to the pharmaceutical aspects as well.
Brilliant. And then the second part of that question was just around any tips around feeding if we are having to eat later at night, or they are home from maybe the late training sessions. They still need a substantial meal, but they have to get to bed early. So
yeah, absolutely. And that the first kind of thing to highlight on that, fed is always best. Okay, so never ever compromise your nutritional intake for the sake of your sleep. It's much better to have that nutritional input inside of you. So never avoid that. In terms of meal structure and meal content, it's not particularly my area of expertise. I don't kind of give the bespoke nutritional advice, but we do see positive effects from certain types of proteins. So things like turkey, chicken, stuff like that can have positive effects on sleep, similar kiwi fruit. So where possible, where somebody's got kind of a very late finish, we do encourage those types of foods to help support the natural sleep as well, and support the sleep cycles. But yeah, I know it's difficult. Fed is always best, and yeah, just do kind of what you can with it. Obviously avoid the very chemically type food, because again, it's an observation I've seen with some of the athletes I work with. When you get in at 9:30 and you're tired, and you just had a really hard training session, it can be a tendency just to grab the crisps and the chocolate and all the very, very processed foods. So eat as natural as you can, because the last thing you want in your system when you're going to go to sleep within the hour is a ton of those chemicals bouncing around. So keep it natural, support it with the white meats if you can, the kiwi fruit if you can, keep it natural, but yeah, always eat.
perfect, thanks very much. So those were really useful. I will now open up to anyone else who wants any questions. And there's a message in the chat, or hang on till the end, and if no one's got any more questions in the next 30 seconds, so we will end it there.
I've got a question. I'm Rosie. I'm a para athlete. I have cerebral palsy. I get tired quite quickly. Should I try and get more sleep than it said for my age?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So generally, I mean, do you know what is your kind of normal sleep duration? Like, how much do you sleep per night normally, do you think?
9 or 9:30, then 9 or
Yeah.
10 hours. Just
9 or 10 hours. Yeah. So are you quite consistent with that as well? So again, we see that's an observation we see in research as well. So generally the para athletes do sleep longer. So the recommendations for those athletes, you can pretty much add on an extra hour compared to anything I've showed you within the first part of that presentation today. And I would also suggest for you, the tracking of that sleep will become really, really important, because actually any deviation from that could be really impactful for you from a performance perspective. So, you would be somebody I would definitely encourage to follow up with those lines of questionnaires, repeat the one that you've done today, see where you're at with it. But yeah, always expect that your sleep is going to be added on a potential hour compared to the recommendations that we've talked about earlier.
okay, thank you.
You're so welcome.
Any more questions for Julie while she's here? Some absolute gold information. Nope. Brilliant. Okay, so just from me personally, and I'm sure on behalf of everyone else, thank you very much again for your time, Julie. We will be stopping the recording here, so just whenever you want to, Julie. And those of you who've attended, thank you very much for your attendance too. Hopefully you learned something and found it as useful as